This article from Time Magazine here is pretty good because the author is actually coming out in favor of more censorship. They don't say it outright, but it doesn't take much reading between the lines to figure out that that's exactly what they want. And it's a perfect illustration of the type of people that enable this kind of thing, that advocate for it, whereas most people it's just kind of a tacit endorsement through silence. The way things get censored and continue to be censored is that the people who actually have the cultural capital, that being mostly the left, the people who have the most mainstream artistic and cultural capital, they don't say shit, which I assume it means they tacitly endorse it. You know, for this kind of stuff to stop, if you actually care about arts, or if you are an artist and you believe in free expression, for this kind of shit to stop, for it to be off the table, it needs to be more than just, say, Ben Shapiro or whoever. It needs to be more than just sort of the people that the left can just dismiss as like, oh, well, those people are crazy. Those people are crazy big. It needs to be a bipartisan drawing a line in the sand. There's two authors in particular who are usually very vocal, but haven't said shit about Roald Dahl being censored, about James Bond being censored. The two people I have in mind are Stephen King and Neil Gaiman. They both sort of maintain a certain level of mainstream cultural capital. You know, not people don't really read anymore. Books aren't really a subject of public conversation, but there's a few authors who still have kind of there's sort of a through line between books and kind of more mainstream franchisable genre entertainment, and that's Stephen King and Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman, for instance, seems perfectly comfortable and eager to discuss literary censorship when it's done by some bumfuck town in Tennessee, but when it's a wholesale rewriting of history, when it is the widespread distortion of an artist's words or artistic intent, people like Neil Gaiman are nowhere to be found. You can get Stephen King talking about Trump in 2023, but you can't get him to lift a finger to say, hey, maybe it's bad that Roald Dahl is being rewritten without any sort of input from the author who is long dead. Maybe that's a bad thing. These books are being censored and rewritten by the same people that Stephen King and Neil Gaiman helped embolden for years and years, so maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe it's a thing of not wanting to lob stones at your own political allies, but if all our artists, if all of our artistic class is so cowardly and partisan to the point where they will stay silent and tolerate books being rewritten, what value is their art in the first place? If these people are so fucking cowardly, of what value is their cowardly, spineless art? On the one hand, maybe it's not fair to judge people by what they're not saying. That's kind of a slippery slope. But when there are people who are so otherwise vocal, but not only that, are very vocal about this specific issue, on issues of censorship, of literary censorship, and then are nowhere to be found when it happens to this extent, in a way that is much more sweeping, much more deleterious to the arts. I don't know. I think it says something. So let's dip into this article a little bit here. This is from Time Magazine. It says, the James Bond literary franchise, written from 1953 to 1966, will receive a sensitivity review ahead of a reissue in April of the 14 novels, which will mark 70 years since Casino Royale, the debut book, was published. Ian Fleming Productions, the company that retains literary rights to the series about 007, the iconic British Secret Service agent, commissioned the review that will see some racially offensive language and outdated stereotypes removed from the works written by the company's namesake. See, this is bad writing. This run on it's anyway. Racial slurs towards black people will be removed, but depictions of other ethnic minorities, such as a Korean character named Oddjob in Goldfinger, the seventh book, will remain. See, this is interesting. The author lumps racial slurs towards black people with depictions of other ethnic minorities. Doesn't qualify what kind of depictions. It just says racial slurs towards black people, then lumps it up with depictions of other minorities, leaving the reader to make the connections in their mind. Am I to assume it's racist for a Korean person to be named Oddjob? I don't know. According to the Telegraph, the new editions will be published alongside an accompanying disclaimer. Okay, so again, this is bad writing. You don't need for it to say published alongside and then an accompanying disclaimer. That is redundant. Why are people who cannot write telling other people what should be written? Anyway, continuing with the article, here's what the disclaimer says. The book was written at a time when terms and attitudes, which might be considered offensive by modern readers, were commonplace. This disclaimer mirrors those put in place by streaming services like Disney+, which added warnings before content with racist depictions, such as The Jungle Book. This, of course, shows the problem with adding disclaimers like this is it never just stops here. It never just stops at trigger warnings and disclaimers. It's always going to graduate into censorship. It never stops. It never stops with sensitivity readers just editing new books. And when very public figures, when very public artists who people listen to, who they respect their opinion, when they don't speak out against stuff like this, when they don't say, hey, sensitivity readers, that's kind of cringe and stupid, it's going to graduate into the next step. Continuing with the article here. According to the Telegraph, most of the revisions pertain to the way black people are described. One such instance is Bond's assertion that suspected African criminals are pretty law-abiding chaps, I should have thought, except when they've drunk too much, which has now been shortened to pretty law-abiding chaps, I should have thought. Another passage that has been completely removed sees Bond witnessing a couple arguing in Harlem in New York City. Fleming wrote that the man and woman spoke in an accent that was straight Harlem, deep South, with a lot of New York thrown in. I'm not sure what would merit offense in this case, but whatever. I haven't read any of these books, so it's hard to say what is the character of Bond speaking, if it's Bond narrating the story and saying these awful, awful things about African Americans, or if it's done in a way such that Ian Fleming is kind of the narrator. Not that it matters. It shouldn't be fucked with or censored either way, but there is sort of a question of artistic intent. Just because you're making a character say something, just because James Bond is saying something offensive, that doesn't mean that the author is then making a judgment. Anyway, then the author goes on a tirade about the sexism in the James Bond books. They're basically saying, well, if the racism is being removed, why not the sexism too? And this is just the point. It doesn't stop. These people are never satisfied. It doesn't stop with just a little bit of censorship. It doesn't stop with just the books I don't like, or it doesn't just stop with books in general. It graduates to films, it graduates to video games, whatever things that you like. Censorship is a encroaching, creeping beast that will, if permitted, will continue to creep in and corrupt and destroy. Another thing that shouldn't be surprising is that these books that are taking these hits lately, Roald Dahl and now James Bond, the thing about them is they're very franchisable. There is a lot of money wrapped up in these properties, and so it shouldn't be surprising as these sort of franchise derivatives of these books. You know, Netflix now owns the Roald Dahl library. There's always talk about watering down the James Bond films. It should be no surprise that the books are then sort of retroactively made to conform to this new vision. But that also begs the question, what's next? Why not Lord of the Rings next? There was just news that the WB wants to make Lord of the Rings into their own Star Wars. They want to make it into this ever-sprawling pop culture franchise. Why not go back and edit those books? Why not edit Dune? Why not edit the Star Wars Expanded Universe books? Whatever it might be. Why not Stephen King? Why not Neil Gaiman? Say you are a person who's like, well, I don't care. I do find these books offensive. These books are offensive and they should be censored and no one should be allowed to read this. The idea that people can be trusted, that they are responsible enough to go so far and then no further is a stupid fucking idea.